Mitch Mitchell watched it happen before every single show. Jimi Hendrix would go into the dressing room as one person, quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible. 30 minutes later, he'd walk out as someone completely different. It was like watching someone put on a mask, Mitch said years later. The real Jimi was very shy. What you saw on stage, that was the character he created to survive. The ritual he used to make that transformation was something nobody knew about until now. London, 1967. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had just formed, and Mitch Mitchell had been drumming with Jimi for exactly 3 weeks. They'd rehearsed together, recorded together, but they hadn't performed together yet. Their first official gig was at the Olympia Theatre in Paris, opening for Johnny Hallyday, France's biggest rock star. Mitch arrived at the venue excited and ready. He'd played hundreds of gigs before. He was a professional drummer who'd worked with everyone from Georgie Fame to the Riot Squad. Stage fright wasn't something he worried about. He expected Jimi to be the same, confident, maybe even cocky. After all, this was the guy who'd been tearing up London's club scene, the guitarist everyone was talking about. But when Mitch walked into the dressing room 2 hours before showtime, he found Jimi sitting in the corner, hunched over, staring at the floor. He wasn't tuning his guitar. He wasn't warming up. He was just sitting there, completely still, barely breathing. "You all right, mate?" Mitch asked. Jimi looked up, and Mitch saw something he'd never expected to see in the eyes of the most confident guitarist in London: pure terror. "I don't know if I can do this," Jimi said quietly. His voice was barely audible. "All those people, looking at me, expecting things." Mitch thought he was joking at first. This was Jimi Hendrix, the guy who jammed with Cream and made Eric Clapton question his own abilities. The guitarist who'd stopped traffic on Carnaby Street just by walking down the sidewalk carrying his Stratocaster. He couldn't be serious about being scared of a concert. But Jimi wasn't joking. His hands were shaking, not slightly, visibly trembling. When he tried to pick up his guitar, he could barely hold it steady. "I've always been like this," Jimi admitted. "Since I was a kid. I can't talk to people, can't look them in the eye. Put me in front of a crowd and I just freeze." Mitch didn't know what to say. In 3 weeks of working together, he'd never seen this side of Jimi. In rehearsals, Jimi was focused and creative. In the studio, he was meticulous and innovative. But both of those environments were controlled, private. This was different. This was public performance, and Jimi was falling apart. "So what do you do? How do you get through it?" Jimi said, "I become someone else." Over the next 30 minutes, Mitch watched Jimi perform what he would later call the most fascinating transformation I've ever witnessed. It started with Jimi standing up and looking at himself in the mirror. He stared at his reflection for a full minute, not moving, barely blinking, just staring.
Then he started talking to himself, not mumbling or whispering, actually talking, carrying on a full conversation with his mirror image. Mitch couldn't hear everything, but he caught fragments. "You're not Jimi anymore. Jimi is scared, but he doesn't have to go out there. Someone else goes out there, someone who isn't afraid." Jimi began physically changing his posture. His shoulders went back, his chin lifted. He rolled his neck, stretched his arms, shook out his legs like a boxer preparing for a fight. The trembling in his hands gradually stopped. He put on his stage clothes slowly, deliberately, like he was putting on armor. The frilled shirt, the velvet jacket, the headband. Each piece of clothing seemed to add another layer of protection between the scared kid from Seattle and the character he was creating. Then came the most crucial part. Jimi picked up his guitar and closed his eyes. He didn't play anything, he just held it, letting his fingers find the familiar shapes on the fretboard, reconnecting with the one thing in the world that never judged him, never scared him, never demanded anything he couldn't give. When he finally opened his eyes and looked at Mitch, he was a different person. The fear was gone. The trembling had stopped. The shy, withdrawn man who'd been sitting in the corner had disappeared, replaced by someone who looked capable of conquering any stage in the world. "Ready?" Jimi asked, and his voice was different too, stronger, more confident. Mitch just nodded, too amazed to speak. That first concert in Paris was explosive. Jimi owned the stage from the first note to the last. He played behind his back, with his teeth, on his knees. He made love to his guitar in ways that shocked the French audience and made Johnny Halliday's people nervous about being upstaged at his own concert. No one in that audience would have believed that 30 minutes earlier, this same man had been too scared to make eye contact. After the show, backstage, Mitch watched the transformation reverse. As soon as they were away from the crowd, Jimmy's shoulders slumped, the confidence drained away. He became quiet again, withdrawn. When fans came backstage asking for autographs, Jimi could barely look at them. He'd sign their programs while staring at the floor, mumbling thank you so quietly they could barely hear him. "It's like you're two different people," Mitch said that night. "I am," Jimi replied. "I have to be." Over the next 3 years, until Jimmy's death in 1970, Mitch witnessed this transformation hundreds of times. Before every concert, without fail, Jimi would go through the same ritual. Sometimes it took 15 minutes, sometimes it took an hour, but it always happened. The mirror conversation, the physical transformation, the reconnection with the guitar, the emergence of the stage persona. And Mitch began to understand something profound. Jimi wasn't faking his stage presence. He was channeling something real. The shy, scared kid was real, but so was the fearless guitar god. Both existed inside the same person, and Jimi had learned to access whichever one he needed for survival.
The shyness caused problems throughout Jimmy's career. Record executives would complain that he wouldn't make eye contact during meetings. Journalists would write that he was difficult to interview because he'd give one-word answers while staring at his shoes. Other musicians would mistake his quietness for arrogance, not realizing he was just terrified of saying the wrong thing. Mitch remembered a particular incident in New York, 1968. They were at a restaurant after a recording session, and a fan recognized Jimi and approached their table. Just a young kid, maybe 19, wanting to tell Jimi how much his music meant to him. Jimi froze, literally couldn't speak. The kid was standing there, excited and nervous himself, waiting for some acknowledgement from his hero. And Jimi just sat there, staring at his plate, his hands starting to shake again. Mitch had to intervene, thanking the kid on Jimi's behalf, explaining that Jimi was tired from recording. After the fan left, disappointed but understanding, Jimi looked at Mitch with genuine pain in his eyes. "Why can't I just talk to people like a normal person?" he asked. "Because you're not a normal person," Mitch said. "You're someone who can make a guitar speak in complete sentences. That's worth a little social awkwardness." But it wasn't just a little awkwardness. It was a fundamental part of who Jimi was, and it affected everything. His relationships suffered because he couldn't communicate what he felt. His business deals went badly because he couldn't assert himself in negotiations. His friendships were complicated because people never knew which version of Jimi they were going to get, the quiet one or the confident one. The transformation ritual became more elaborate over time. Mitch noticed Jimi adding new elements. Sometimes he'd listen to specific music before going on stage, not rock and roll, but jazz or classical music that seemed to calm him. Sometimes he'd meditate, sitting cross-legged on the dressing room floor for 20 minutes, completely still. Before the Woodstock performance in 1969, Mitch watched Jimi spend nearly 2 hours preparing. The stakes were enormous, 500,000 people, possibly the biggest audience of his career. Jimi was so nervous he actually got sick, throwing up in the bathroom before the show. "Maybe we should cancel," Mitch suggested. "Tell them you're ill." "No," Jimi said, wiping his mouth, steadying himself against the sink. That's Jimmy talking. Jimmy is sick. Jimmy is scared. But the other guy, he can do this. He can play for 1,000,000 people if he has to. And he did. The Woodstock performance became legendary. But Mitch knew what it had cost Jimmy to get there. The hours of self-talk, the physical transformation, the sheer force of will required to become someone brave enough to walk onto that stage. The other members of the experience, bassist Noel Redding, knew about Jimmy's shyness too, but they dealt with it differently. Noel sometimes got frustrated with it, interpreting Jimmy's quietness as lack of communication or leadership. But Mitch, who'd witnessed the transformation so many times, understood it as something deeper. He's not being difficult, he's fighting a war inside himself every single day. The fact that he wins that war often enough to perform is incredible.
There were nights when Jimmy couldn't make the transformation work. His anxiety would be too strong, his fear too overwhelming. Mitch remembered a show in Stockholm where Jimmy tried for an hour to get into character and just couldn't do it. They had to cancel the concert, telling the venue that Jimmy had food poisoning. In reality, he was sitting in the dressing room, crying quietly, hating himself for not being stronger. "I should be able to do this," he told Mitch that night. "Everyone thinks I'm this confident person. If they knew the truth." "The truth is that you're human," Mitch said, "and you're doing something incredibly difficult. Most people who feel the way you do never get on stage at all. You do it almost every night. That's not weakness, that's strength." The ritual wasn't just about overcoming fear. Mitch came to realize it was about protection. The stage persona, the wild, confident, fearless Jimi Hendrix that audiences saw, was a shield that protected the vulnerable person underneath. When Jimmy played with his teeth or set his guitar on fire, he wasn't showing off. He was hiding behind spectacle, giving audiences something to look at that wasn't him. "The more outrageous I am on stage," Jimmy once told Mitch, "the less they actually see me. They see the tricks and the fire and the noise. They don't see the scared kid who can't order a sandwich without stammering." This revelation changed how Mitch understood Jimmy's entire approach to performance. Every wild gesture, every outrageous moment wasn't confidence, it was camouflage. Jimmy had learned that if he could control what people looked at, he could control what they saw. In interviews, Jimmy would give vague, dreamy answers to questions, talking about electric ladylands and astral planes. People thought he was being mystical or philosophical, but Mitch knew the truth. Jimmy was uncomfortable with direct questions about himself, so he deflected into abstract concepts. It was another form of the same protective mask. The saddest part, Mitch reflected years later, was that the mask worked too well. People fell in love with the character Jimmy created, never knowing the real person underneath. The shy, thoughtful, gentle man who wrote poetry in notebooks and cried at beautiful music and couldn't make eye contact with strangers. That person remained invisible, protected by the very shield he'd created. "I sometimes wonder if anyone really knows me," Jimmy told Mitch during a quiet moment in 1970, just months before his death. "The real me, I mean, not the stage guy. I know you. I see you transform. I see both versions, and I can tell you they're both real. The shy guy is you. The confident guy is you too. You're not faking anything. You're just complex." Jimmy smiled at that. Complex. That's a nice way of saying messed up. It's a nice way of saying human. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Mitch lost more than a bandmate or a musical partner. He lost the person he'd watched fight and win an impossible battle almost every night for 3 years. The obituaries and tributes all focused on Jimmy the innovator, the genius, the guitar god. Almost none of them mentioned Jimmy the shy kid who had to become someone else just to function in public.
In interviews over the decades that followed, Mitch tried to correct the record. He wanted people to know that the real Jimi Hendrix was more impressive than the legend. The legend was a fearless rock god. The reality was a terrified young man who taught himself to be fearless through sheer force of will. When people tell me Jimi was the most confident performer they ever saw, Mitch said in a 1985 interview, I tell them they're right. But they don't understand what that confidence cost him. It wasn't natural. It wasn't easy. It was something he had to create from nothing 30 minutes before every show through a ritual that most people would find bizarre if they witnessed it. Very shy, Mitch would say when people asked what Jimi was really like. Painfully shy. The shyness never went away. He just learned to hide it better than anyone I've ever known. The transformation ritual Jimi used became something Mitch thought about for the rest of his life. He wondered if everyone has to do something similar, create a version of themselves brave enough to face whatever scares them. Maybe Jimi's process was just more visible, more necessary, more dramatic than most people's, but the principle was universal. Sometimes you have to become someone else to survive being yourself. Years after Jimi's death, Mitch visited Graceland and saw the room where Elvis Presley prepared before shows. He saw the rituals, the preparations, the transformation process. And he realized that maybe all great performers go through something similar. Maybe stage presence isn't about confidence at all. Maybe it's about having the courage to pretend you're confident until the pretending becomes real. But he never saw anyone do it quite like Jimi. The mirror conversations, the physical transformation, the way Jimi could literally become a different person in 30 minutes, that was unique, that was special. That was the secret behind one of rock and roll's greatest performers. The real Jimi Hendrix was very shy, but the Jimi Hendrix he created was fearless. And somehow, impossibly, both were true at the same time. If this story about the real person behind the legend moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who's ever felt too scared to be themselves. Have you ever had to become someone else to face your fears? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to turn on notifications for more untold stories about the humanity behind music's greatest icons.